Hello and welcome to this episode of Denny's Tips, where you're going to learn about luminosity masking, one of my favorite Photoshop techniques. Luminosity masking lets you make a layer visible according to the brightness value of your photo. For example, you can brighten your photo and then apply luminosity masking so that it doesn't overexpose the areas that are already bright to begin with. You can also apply color grading effects to different tonal areas like just the shadows or just the highlights. You can do stuff like HDR tone mapping, and there's a lot more you can do. Luminosity masking is one of the oldest and most useful retouching techniques. I've been teaching this since the beginning of my first Photoshop website, which was over 12 years ago, and I've seen others teaching it even earlier, over 15 years ago. But despite it being old, it's still being used today in pretty much the same way. In this Photoshop tutorial, you'll learn the two most useful and common methods for luminosity masking. So if you're ready, let's get started. There's two ways to do luminosity masking in Photoshop. One is with a layer mask, and the other is with a layer style. There's pros and cons to both, but I'll start with the layer mask method. First, as an example, I'm going to add a brightness contrast adjustment layer and then bump up the brightness. You can now see that the image is brighter, but the inside of the building is way overexposed. Using luminosity masking, we can fix this by making the layer only affect the shadows. Here's how to do it. First, make sure that the layer mask is selected in your layers panel. Then go to Image, Apply Image. This tool lets you place any layer into your current layer or layer mask. It also gives you a lot of options. So for example, you can choose the layer, you can choose the channel, you can choose whether to invert the layer or not, set the blending mode, and a lot more. It's quite powerful, but for this image, we're just going to leave the layer set to merge, and I'm going to enable the invert option, and the blending mode should be set to either multiply or normal. And then when you're ready, click OK. Our image looks much better, but what exactly happened? Look in the layers panel, you can see that we now have an inverted copy of the image in the layer mask. You can also hold the Alt or Option key and click on the layer mask thumbnail to preview how it looks. So here we can see that this brightness contrast layer is only being shown in the white areas here, which are the dark spots in the photo. And inside the building, which originally was overexposed, it's now being masked out and it looks normal again. So this is a great way to selectively pick the tonal areas that your layer should appear in. You can also go further and start manipulating the layer mask. For example, if we use the Levels tool by pressing Ctrl or Command L, we can make the layer mask brighter or darker. We can increase the contrast, lift the blacks, drop the whites. It's quite flexible. Another thing you can do is to blur the layer mask. If we look at the area here, you can see that the contrast is a bit low, but we can blur it to increase the clarity. To do this, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. If you use a small setting like 3 pixels, it will sharpen the edges for better results. If you use a large number like 20 pixels, it will increase the clarity like this. But if you do this, be careful of halos that can appear between light and dark areas. For example, look at the roof here. You can see that there's a slight glow around it. For this image, it's not really that noticeable, but it's something that you need to be careful of whenever you're doing this. So that was the first method to use luminosity masking. Here's how it looks like before and after. You can also use it with other layers such as the vibrance or saturation layer, the color lookup layer, and more. But there are also layers that you don't need to use it for, such as the color balance and the tone curve. I'll explain more about that later. But first, let's learn the second method of luminosity masking. So most people use the first method that I just saw because it's the most widely taught. But there's more efficient ways to luminosity mask. And instead of using a layer mask, you can use a layer style instead. The layer style method is the one that you should be using whenever you can. Anyways, let me show you how it's done. I'm going to delete this layer mask because we don't need it anymore. And to apply luminosity masking to this layer, just right click on the layer and then go to blending options. Here in the blend if setting, you can change the tonal areas where the layer is visible. So if I drag the white input slider towards the left, the layer will only be visible in these tonal ranges. And as I adjust, you can see the bright areas being restored. But if we look at the results, the transition is really sharp and you get a lot of ugly artifacts. There's a trick to smooth this out, and it took me years before I found out about this. If you hold the Alt or Option key, the slider will split in half and you can fade it out like this. If you want really smooth results, you can even drag the sliders all the way to both ends like this. By the way, there's two bars here which you can adjust. Basically it's like this. The top layer will tell Photoshop to show this layer if the layer is within these tonal ranges. The bottom one will tell Photoshop to show the layer if the underlying layer is within these tonal ranges. You can just try out both to see which one works better, but a lot of times it doesn't really matter which one you use, you'll still be able to get good results from both. Okay, so we're done with the luminosity mask. Here's how it looks like before and after. Now even though the layer style is more efficient, you can't manipulate the mask like you can with an actual layer mask. So you can't do things like apply a Gaussian blur or use the levels tool on the layer mask, but it's more efficient and it's lighter weight. There are also times when you don't even need to use luminosity masking. For example, the color balance adjustment already lets you select different tonal ranges. So let's say you want to tint the shadows blue. Just select shadows from the drop-down menu and do it from there. It's much more efficient than creating your own luminosity mask. Same with the curves adjustment, it already lets you pick which tonal areas you want to adjust. So if you don't want your adjustment to show up in the highlights, then just don't make any changes to the highlights. Luminosity masking is also built into some filters like the Smart Sharpen filter. And typically I'll see people use luminosity masking with a sharpened layer. Again, if the built-in luminosity masking is good enough, there's no need to do it yourself. Anyways, that's how you do luminosity masking in Photoshop. There are some Photoshop plugins for luminosity masking, but I find that it's something that's already easy and fast to do. In fact, I would say that in most situations, it's actually faster to do it by yourself than it is to use a plugin. The only time I would recommend those plugins is if you're doing something complicated with many layers such as HDR tone mapping. By the way, if you're interested in HDR tone mapping, you can download my set of Photoshop actions which will let you tone map multiple exposures in just a couple clicks. You don't need to pay for it because the free version is sufficient for most people's needs. And if you're interested, you can find the download link in the video description. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video. Luminosity masking is one of my favorite techniques and you can do so much with it, so I encourage you to experiment and try different ways of using it. Also, if you like this video, you might like my other video on how to use the tone chart in Photoshop. Basically, that video will show you how to use the curves adjustment in a more understandable and easier way. So if you're interested, click on the video to watch it. Anyways, thanks for watching guys. If you liked the video, please subscribe to my channel. I hope you guys have an awesome day and I'll catch you guys next week.